So here we enter into the workshop of Giovanni Bellini yet again for part 3 of our series on him, the Nexus of Invention. And tonight we're really going to conclude we're going to conclude with a complete sense of why this workshop is called the Nexus of Invention, because not only did Bellini introduce an entirely new footing, he placed oil painting in Italy on an entirely new footing in his lifetime, but he also started to respond to the artists who developed upon the method he pioneered or the approach that he pioneered. So we're going to see how his inventiveness went both ways. It didn't only draw from the past, but it also drew extensively from the present. And then it also really did project far into the future, because his legacy really did transform the history of art. Okay, so we're going to look at a lot of stuff tonight. We're going to look at a lot of paintings, only 4 of Bellini's, other than the introduction screen, this amazing Christ blessing from 1500, which we finished the session with last week. But we're going to see some amazing work after I've given a brief introduction and recap. So welcome to part 3, everyone. We're going to have a fantastic session. It's going to be full of action today, and we're going to look at how Bellini, his role within his own present and his role in shaping the future of painting, and his present really did, his present world, his living world during his later years was really dominated, or was really influenced by Titian and Giorgione, 2 painters who had been really influenced by Bellini himself. So we have already assessed and summarized Bellini's artistic foundations as a member of Jacopo Bellini's school and his household, with its intersecting strands of artistic thought. We did that in the first week. And we learned about how his father had been trained by the Gothic artist Gentile da Fabriano, who had also not only trained Jacopo Bellini, Bellini's father, but he'd also trained Pisanello and Domenico Veneziano at a time when perspective and idealized figurative naturalism were being developed in Florence. And Jacopo was in Florence in the early 1420s, which is how Bellini came to be influenced very profoundly by the Florentine school and the sculptural tilt of the Florentines, notably Donatello. He was influenced by sculpture very deeply, and Donatello had made a huge impact on not just sculpture, but really drawing and painting as well. And he was also influenced, Bellini was also heavily influenced by his brother-in-law, his older brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna. And his early interests are really therefore sculptural, and but he also has a very keen interest in the settings of his subjects and in landscape and in the relationships between different genres of painting, as we've been discovering. Last week, we also saw how oil painting was adapted into an entirely new painterly approach, and which subsequently took hold in Italy, with Antonello da Messina playing a central role. We analysed the role of drawing in tempera versus oil painting, and revealed that Giovanni Bellini was at the centre of a new development in art which would shape the future of painting. So what happened was, drawing was so fundamental to painting in tempera, but when artists started to work in oils, they could explore far more different avenues before the painting was completed, because oil paint meant that they could detach the direction of the painting away from the preliminary or the preparatory design. Fresco and tempera painting really relies upon a preparatory design for the painting to be executed, whereas with oils you can introduce layers of greater transparency or layers of greater opacity to rework areas and work with more layers to introduce new ideas when the painting is already underway. That's not something you could do in tempera, and certainly isn't something you can do in fresco. And Bellini really was central in developing a new approach to oil painting. But today we're going to look at 4 of Bellini's paintings after this welcome screen, so 5 in total, as a matter of fact, ranging from around 1500, which is this painting, up to 1515, which is when Bellini was in his 80s and the year before he died. The paintings we're going to look at today are going to illustrate the remarkable contribution to the history, development, and transformation of painting. Bellini's remarkable contribution to those things. He set painting itself on a new footing, which enabled his own students to find an entirely new vision of painting, or a more authentic revival of classical tradition. So if we think of Giorgione's new manner of painting, which was inherently poetic, ambiguous, and ambiguous in the sense that it doesn't have a clear subject, a clearly defined subject, or even a definable subject. They're just paintings which encapsulate poetic beauty, poetic ambiguity, and are very open to interpretation. And that approach, or that philosophy, or that axiom which underpinned Giorgione's approach, that painting was a silent poetry, it seemed new, it seemed utterly revolutionary, and it was, but it was also deeply reactionary as well, because that idea of painting being a form of silent poetry goes back to Plutarch, okay, to the 1st century. So these ideas which Bellini really facilitated through his contribution led back further into the past, while simultaneously ushering in an entirely new revolutionary present and future in painting. So it's very interesting, but that's what history is. So we didn't cover much of his life in this series. If we do a series on Bellini again, which I'm sure we will at some point in the future, well, we looked at his early life, we looked at his contribution to oil painting last week, and I'll mention just one big factor in his life right now, and that is that he became painter to the Republic of Venice in 1483. In 1483, the Quattrocento is winding down to its close. We're in the twilight years of the 15th century and entering into the working towards the Cinquecento, the 16th century, and Giovanni Bellini lived into the first quarter of the Cinquecento, the 1500s. And he sort of enters into the High Renaissance. He sort of lays the foundations for the High Renaissance in Venice. And being the painter to the Republic of Venice from 1483 onwards really does show that he was inseparable from our understanding of the Venetian school and its development and its foundations. And him being the painter to the Republic of Venice. Now, Venice was a very powerful republic in early modern Italy, in the early modern world, and it had ties across the world and across Christendom into the East. And him being the chief painter to the Republic meant that he was an incredibly influential and famous artist in his own time, and him being made painter to the Republic in the 1480s, and yet holding that position up until 1516, the year of his death, shows that he was an artist of the very highest caliber, in the first rank of his day. Okay, and it's been really amazing exploring his work over the last couple of weeks, and I've no doubt that you're going to have an absolutely fabulous session right now as we look at at part 3. All right, so here we go. We didn't really get much time to look at this last week, so here we go. We've got the Palaproili altarpiece, which is a funerary devotional work painted for a sepulchre, to be the altarpiece in a funerary sepulchre. It's got an amazing sense of color to it. The colors are truly brilliant, vibrant, and absolutely vivid, really, really vivid and vivacious. And they speak of the beauty of the sky. They speak of the volume and texture of the fabrics. They speak of the solidity and hardness of the architecture and the marble tiles on the floor. And so the color is really there to enhance the visual experience of all of the different physical elements within the painting, including the sky and the clouds. So that beauty of the sky is reminiscent of Bellini's earlier work, where he would really emphasize the true nature of the landscape and the familiar aspects of the landscape of his own region. The brilliance of the color is also there to give warmth and humanity and presence and immediacy to the figures there. You can see that the sun-tanned skin of the male saints and the donor in the front, and the two monks. We've got St. Mark and, well, possibly St. Mark on the right, but most certainly St. Peter on the left there, holding the keys to heaven. And then we have the two monks in their white habits behind the saints, and then we have the donor in the foreground. The colors are really there to give immediacy and a sense of flesh to them, and the color really does give an amazing sense of volume to all of the draperies. And as you can see, he's really exploiting the layerability of oil paint to enhance that sense of volume, but also movement. The movement implied in the drapery of the Virgin is really quite compelling, because it is quite spread out across the architecture. It's sort of enveloping her body, and it brings us a sense of her body as well, because it sort of is really quite tightly draped around that arm. It shows the movement and tension in the arm, in her left arm coming up to rest on the throne, but then also her right leg, and the drapery flowing down onto the stairs really does give us a sense of movement, as though some of that drapery has been left there from her movement onto the throne. So the drapery is really there telling a physical story and a temporal story as well about her physical presence. The richness of the fabrics is really accented and brought into focus with the colors, really. And it's Bellini's use of oil paint which enables him to do that and to bring out so much depth and light in them, with numerous layers of glazing. See, with oil, you can increase the transparency of the paint by adding more oil, and it's quite an advantage to add sun thickened oil, because it makes the oil more malleable on the surface, and you can increase transparency in certain areas. It's not something you could do very effectively with tempera, although you did layer in tempera and build up from light to dark and paint in numerous layers, but you can't enhance the transparency or the translucency and gloss of tempera, and it dries very quickly, so you can't manipulate it once you've applied it as you can with oil. And oil also gives a lot of reflectivity and luminosity to the pigments, which tempera doesn't do to the same extent. And so that technical advancement has really enabled so much more exploration of visual effect in the hands of this great artist, Giovanni Bellini. So we've got the solidity and the weight of form as well, which he has explored. There's still lots of sculptural elements here, especially with the architecture. Amazing use of perspective. Now, perspective was really fundamental to painting by this point, especially if you're going to do a sacred conversazione, which this painting is. It's a sacred conversation between the Virgin Mary and child with saints. That setting has to take place within an environment which is mathematically worked out with perspective, to give it that spatial naturalism which is so fundamental to Renaissance painting, and which distinguishes much of Renaissance painting from medieval and Gothic painting. And this subject, the Sacred Conversazione, was really pioneered in the Renaissance. And we saw one a few weeks ago, didn't we, in week 2 on Mantegna. And actually, I can spoil you a bit and show you a couple of examples of Sacra Conversazione. There's a beautiful one there. This is by an artist I already mentioned earlier, Domenico Veneziano, who was another artist who was trained by Gentile da Fabriano. He was a contemporary of Bellini's father. And this is perhaps the earliest example of a distinctively Sacra Conversazione painting, a sacred conversation between the Madonna and Child accompanied by saints in an architectural setting. Now, this artist, Domenico Veneziano, was trained by Gentile da Fabriano, who didn't use perspective to this extent. But what you can see here is that he is really using perspective to order the floor and all of the architecture within the scene. And he painted this sometime between 1445 and 1447, which makes it, you know, quite a remarkable early exploration of the potential of artists to paint a full architectural scene with numerous figures interacting in proportion with one another. It's an early example of an artist in the first half of the 15th century using perspective and figurative naturalism together in this typically Renaissance subject, the Sacra Conversazione, which really does start with artists like Fra Angelico, Domenico Veneziano, who we can see there at the top right, and also Piero della Francesca and Andrea Mantegna. Okay, so that's an amazing Sacra Conversazione painting painted by Domenico Veneziano. It's called the Santa Lucia dei Magnoli altarpiece, and it's currently in the Uffizi in Florence. So what he's doing here, Giovanni Bellini, if I just move to the next slide so to stop distracting you with the Veneziano, we've got this amazing, we're back to this amazing image, and we can really see how Bellini is using perspective, not in as complex a way as Veneziano did in that slightly earlier painting, or significantly earlier painting about 50 years before. He's using architecture and perspective to enhance the physicality, the physical presence, and the immanence of the subjects, the Virgin and Child and the saints around her. So that's really, you know, he's really simplified this painting. There isn't so much going on, and he's also compositionally been incredibly clever with it, because it has the sense of an interior with the architecture there, and it has a sense of an interior because there is that marble throne. But then that lower band, there are 3 bands to this landscape, 3 horizontal bands, and I've spoken about bands last week, the banded composition that Bellini uses throughout his career. That lower band is the floor, with a tiled floor. Then we've got another band, like a wall behind them. And then with the third band is the sky. And that sky gives us a sense of the outdoors. And so there's this multidimensionality to this single painting, which gives it a sense of space, a sense of serenity, and a sense of air and lightness within a scene which is all about devotion. And it's got a very quiet and subtle and poetic, emotional sense to it. And that is just brought together in this serene landscape, in a serene setting, which comprises both interior and landscape. And that sky also gives us a sense of infinity, doesn't it? That sense of infinite space. That's what perspective is there to facilitate. Linear perspective is there to facilitate artists in their desire or their aim to represent a regressive space. But the sky without a visible horizon line gives us that sense of infinity. And I'm not sure whether we could say or argue that, you know, the idea of infinity is an important aspect to the narrative that Bellini is deliberately trying to conjure here, but I definitely think that the visual aspect of the sky does that intuitively, whether or not that was a part of the narrative intent of the artist. So I did mention another Sacra Conversazione painting slightly earlier, didn't I? Other than the Veneziano, and it was this one, which I'll just ping up very briefly here as we're looking at this. That is Mantegna Sanzino altarpiece, which is a really significant point of reference for the development of the Sacra Conversazione genre. This is one that Mantegna painted between 1457 and 1460, and in 1460 Mantegna, as you remember, joined the court of the Gonzaga family in Mantua and was at that point one of the most sought after artists in northern Italy. And so Mantegna painted that Sacra Conversazione in the late 1450s, and Domenico Veneziano painted his Sacra Conversazione in the mid 1440s. So you can see how things are developing very quickly. There are lots of elements in the other Sacra Conversazione paintings that have found their way into Bellini's one. The architecture is very important in all three of these examples. The frame in this painting isn't original though, while the frame in the Mantegna is original, but the frames in both paintings really do interact with the architecture and the structure of the paintings themselves, turning them into triptychs essentially. Okay, so I'm just going to remove the Mantegna for you so you can go back to your Bellini. Okay, so seeing some really good points of reference there. So this painting, I may have mentioned last week, but I'll just go over it again because there may be some of you who weren't here last week. We've got the kneeling donor in the foreground who donated funds or other commodities for the creation of this painting, and possibly for other parts of the sepulchre and funerary chapel, which was for Pietro Pruilli, which is why this painting is called the Palla Pruilli altarpiece. And Bellini painted it, as you can see, sometime between 1505 and 1510. So it's really his going into his mature or later period at this point, which is probably why the colors are so rich. The narrative is so subtle. We still do get a sense of expression, but they're far less dramatic than in the earlier paintings. If you cast your mind back to last week and the week before, some of the expressions that Bellini would paint in people's faces were really quite were more like grimaces, really quite intense, really quite noisy, whereas these are far quieter, more subtle, more delicate, but yet still very immediate and very compelling. There's a much calmer atmosphere, a sense of stillness, but also subtle movement with the tilts in the head, the various heads tilting. They're all at different angles. They all look different. You've got that monk in the background behind St. Mark with his head tilting forward. We've got Mark reading a book, reading from a book. So there's a sense of dialogue to the painting and exchange, ideas that were written being voiced or read, experienced in the present. You know, the word which is written is from another mind, is from a historical mind, or in the case of Christianity, often from a divine mind or a divine will, and that is being interacted with in this painting. And then we have Saint Peter, who looks like he's moving forward. The pose of his feet implies his movement towards the center of the painting, or maybe he's just stepped in to the painting frame. So there are these elements of movement, of dynamism, of emotion, and of dialogue, but they're incredibly subtle and delicate, which shows artistic maturity and taste that Bellini has at this point. Really quite exceptional. All right, so good. We have got to move on quite quickly today because there's one painting I want us to spend plenty of time on. So what we're going to do now is move on to our next painting, but which we're going to look at very briefly. So just time for a quick sketch on the next one. It's this one that I had to include because you couldn't do a series on Bellini without mention of the San Zaccaria altarpiece, which is this totally unbelievably phenomenal painting, which is in the Church of San Zaccaria in Venice, painted possibly around the same time as the Palla Paruoli. And it's actually a far more complex painting and is far more associated with Bellini and his mature style. The Palla Paruoli is a far lesser known piece than the San Zaccaria altarpiece. Now, you can tell immediately that the San Zaccaria altarpiece and the Palla Paruoli are the same subject. That figure in the foreground reading the book, that is another saint. The figure behind that figure with the book is another saint. The two figures on the left are two saints. So we don't have a donor here. We don't have monks here. We do have the Virgin and Child though, and we also do have a youth, possibly an angel playing a viol or a viola down there. The Virgin and Child is more elevated than prior. Now this is an incredible painting, and it is the same subject as the Palla Paruoli. It's a Sacra Conversazione. We've got perspective in the floor, in the foreground. We've got architecture, and we've got this amazing sort of, it's like the church extends into the painting, but then we've also got the outdoors as well, which is really, really uncanny. He's making really classical references here, but he's making lots of different references that stretch very far and very wide. The mosaic alcove, for example, the sort of inner wall of that dome in the chapel is mosaicked, which is a direct reference to the art of the Byzantine Empire, which Bellini was very, very familiar with, having lived in Venice his entire life. You think of Venice, you think of the connections to the East and to Byzantium, and that connection is made really, is really brought to life with that mosaic interior there, gold mosaic there. So here we've got the San Zaccaria altarpiece, which is probably one of the paintings that I'm most excited to be looking at and most excited to have included in this series on Bellini. It's another Sacra Conversazione, as I've mentioned. We've got St. Peter there on the left, we've got St. Catherine behind St. Peter, then we've got San Lucia, St. Lucy, behind St. Jerome, who is there, one of the church fathers wearing canonical red, which shows that he is one of the more ancient saints, one of the fathers who laid the foundations of Christendom and the transmission of Christian belief and the dissemination of Christian belief by translating the Vulgate. And as you can see, he's in a very similar position and pose to St. Mark in the previous Sacra Conversazione. He's there holding a book and looking down at the book, but he's dressed differently, and he's also depicted with a beard and white gloves, as he often was. And then we have Saint Lucia behind him. She's holding sort of a glass or a crystal vial. She's the martyr who was blinded, had her eyes plucked because of her refusal to denounce her faith. Then we have St. Catherine, who was martyred on the wheel. And then in front of St. Catherine there on the left, we've got St. Peter again, once more, who's holding a text and who is also holding the keys to heaven. And so similar composition, we've got those four figures either side of the Virgin, and instead of the kneeling donor, we've got the youth in the foreground with the vial, and then the Virgin and Child elevated on that throne. So it's, you know, now upon closer analysis, upon closer looking, we can actually see a great deal of similarities with the previous painting. He does really, I mean, this is painted around the same time though, and yet there seems to be such an amazing change, and it's hard to tell which one he did first. We don't know. It might, it might be possible to find out by looking at archives and by looking at manuscripts, but it's very hard to date things precisely all the time. And art historians and historians are very, very aware of that. And it's a difficult scholarly and intellectual challenge to actually place things in a chronological order. You can't always do it with drawings and paintings and works of art because the documentary evidence is often lacking. But what we can see here is that there are some real similarities with that previous artwork, the Palla Pruili, such as that landscape being integrated into the painting. It's that, but instead of the landscape being on a horizontal band distinct from the figures, there are two slithers of landscape either side of the chapel, and it just gives you that feeling that the space opens up into this really bucolic, open world. And that relationship between the architecture and the landscape creates this sense of otherworldliness, of transcendence, a real heavenly sort of setting of perfectly ordered architecture with natural beauty as well, that harmony between man-made beauty, man-made order, and natural beauty of the organic world. So yeah, it's absolutely astonishing, really. There's a great sense of quietness to this painting, as there was in the previous one, but also a gripping sense of emotion with the different gazes and tilts of the heads in the saints. There's a great solemnity and quietness in the painting, except for the music being played by the viol player. It's intense and it's very gripping, and yet incredibly quiet and serene. And so there are these complex attributes to the painting which make it an expression of painting's real capacity to express poetic values. And it's artworks like this that really elevated artists in this period. This is a period in which artists really ascended socially, and it was because of artworks like this that established artists as on the same status, as belonging to the same intellectual and cultural status as intellectuals, poets and philosophers and mathematicians and literate people, highly literary people, highly educated people who are worthy of that level of regard. So it also does refer to lots of other artists. There's lots of Florentine elements to this painting as well. The architecture and the assimilation of the architecture within the space of the church. So the architecture of this painting in conjunction with the architecture of the church. And that's something that Mantegna did, and which Mantegna did as a member of the distinctly Paduan school, but was very heavily influenced by the Florentines because of the influence of Donatello. And if we think back to an earlier artist from Florence, Masaccio, who painted his amazing Santa Trinita, where in the Santa Maria, no, it's in the Basilica della Santa Maria Novella, del Santa Maria Novella in Florence, where Masaccio Santa Trinita is there in the nave, and that chapel just opens in to this sense of space, illusion of space. But and that's totally unbelievable and incredible. But yet in the Masaccio, you don't see the floor. The floor is eye level with you, and the vanishing point is floor level, so you don't see the tiled floor, but you see the curved vaulted ceiling. But in this painting, you see the floor and the ceiling and the landscape as well. So it's so much more complex and multidimensional. There's a great sense of volume in the draperies because of the glazing technique that I mentioned in the previous painting, but also there's such a great dramatic effect caused by the chiaroscuro, the dynamics of the lights and the darks in this painting. It gives you that sort of round sense of form of the chapel, and it also fits into the setting in San Zaccaria with the light coming from the upper left. And so that illusion of this space being part of the church environment, but also leading into this mystical and or divine realm, is really a fascinating relationship to witness. So he plays this game that Mantegna plays of having the painting interact with the space that the painting is installed in. So the actual physical environment of the chapel does actually interact in an illusionistic way with the painting, but yet this painting doesn't have any parts coming out of it, which is something that Mantegna did do, especially in his Ascension of the Virgin. So yeah, absolutely. This really did inspire so many artists, and it is a painting where Bellini also starts to show how he may have been inspired by his own younger contemporaries. So Giorgione actually painted his Castelfranco Madonna the year before. So this painting, painted in 1505, it was in 1504 that Giorgione, a former pupil of Giovanni Bellini, painted his Castelfranco Madonna, which has a Madonna in a landscape and the Madonna elevated above the saints, and compositionally there are lots of similarities with this painting. And so while a lot of the ideas in that painting would have initially been introduced, or a lot of those ideas would have been planted or seeded by Bellini, it was Giorgione who really executed them in a novel way, in a new way, which may have then inspired Bellini to paint the San Zaccaria altarpiece in this manner. So that is quite an extraordinary reference point, which shows how, just to what extent Bellini was this nexus of invention. He contributed and he absorbed, and then he reinvented himself. And that's what you can really see in this painting. Okay, so it's an absolutely unbelievable example of Venetian painting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at another late Bellini painting, which he painted in 1414. Now, the reason it says 1414 to 1429, we know that Bellini had already passed away by 1529. Giovanni Bellini died in 1516. So why on earth has this painting then been worked on up until 1529? Well, that is because Titian also worked on this painting. He didn't have anything to do with it when Bellini first painted it in 1514. It was much later that Titian and also Dosso Dossi worked on this painting. We don't see much of the Dossi work on it, except for that amazing pheasant in the tree. Look in the upper right, you can see a pheasant. That wasn't painted by Bellini, and it wasn't painted by Titian either. It was painted by Dosso Dossi, another, a painter who was from Ferrara. Okay, so we've got this amazing pastoral scene in the Feast of the Gods, which is painted by Bellini and Titian, and it should also say Dosso Dossi as well, except the only Dosso Dossi work we can see is perhaps some of the foliage in the upper right, but that wonderful pheasant there. It's a very lively scene, it's a very mischievous scene, and very shortly we're going to zoom in just to look at those figures in the foreground. Okay, so we're going to lose the landscape and focus on the figures to give you a chance to do lots of scribbles and lots of quick sketching of the different figures there in the front. So we're depicting the Roman gods Jupiter, Apollo, Neptune, and Priapus, alongside satyrs and nymphs. And there are lots of goings on here, which might not have been entirely approved of in Bellini's time. Maybe they wouldn't be entirely approved of now. But what it does show is Bellini responding to classical literature, and lots of the classical authors like Catullus and like Ovid, it's taken from Ovid, this story, and the story of the Feast of the Gods. They did tell stories of the gods behaving in ways that show them to be no more moral than humans. They succumb to their base nature and instincts just as we do. Okay, so we've got satyrs and nymphs and various other gods and various gods from Roman mythology, and this is a scene from Ovid. And you know, artists started to show their classical erudition beyond Christian theology and Christian narratives in this period. The revival of classical Greek and Roman culture really did change people's opinions of the ancient world and of ancient Greek and Roman culture. If you think about the architecture depicted in the Sacra Conversazione paintings, from Domenico Veneziano to Andrea Mantegna to Giovanni Bellini, classical architecture is derived from ancient Roman examples. And in the Renaissance, people didn't just think that because these were ancient, this was an ancient civilization, that their ideas and that their philosophy, that their literature, that their culture was inferior. They thought that their architecture is so ordered, it's so perfect, there must be something to say about their literature, about their ideas, about their culture as well. And so the Renaissance, in many ways, was an attempt by artists, intellectuals, known in the Renaissance as humanists, to revive and reevaluate their present day's relationship with Europe's ancient past, the Greco-Roman past of European civilization. And they found that there were lots of really inspiring and foundational things in ancient Greek and Roman writing. And so the humanists like Machiavelli were very, very inspired by the writings of Cicero. And lots of Renaissance philosophers like Marcellino Ficino were very inspired by the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato. And a lot of Renaissance artists were heavily inspired by the writings of ancient authors like Virgil, like Catullus, and like Ovid, for their epic poems that tell of metamorphoses and feasts and interactions between various different gods and mortals. And the reason that the artists started to respond to this stuff was because their patrons wanted to show that they could acquire artworks from the greatest and most famous and sought after painters of their day and get them to do paintings that reflected the patron's erudition and the patron's grasp of culture and the patron's ability to converse on these topics. It would give a patron the chance to tell a story in a way that showed how erudite they were and how sophisticated and how worthy they were to rank among the cultural elite of their day. So this painting was commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara, Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, and it was to be hung in a small room, Camera de Alabasto, and the small room of alabaster. Okay, and the reason it's called that is because the Camera de Alabasto was a small, very private room where Alfonso d'Este may have entertained a few guests, but where he would have had a lot of time on his own to contemplate and to enjoy the arts. It was a room to be filled with beautiful things, artifacts and objects. And the alabaster would have been pieces of sculpture and, you know, objects that would have stimulated his interest and would have inspired him a place of respite and a place of culture, contemplation, and self-nurturing through the arts. And he wanted the greatest painters in the world to decorate this room. He wanted Michelangelo, he wanted Giovanni Bellini, he wanted Fra Bartolomeo, he wanted Raphael to decorate this room with paintings. He commissioned paintings from the greatest artists of his day to go into this room. And as you can see, this is on canvas as it's written. And the reason it's on canvas is because this the painters were from Florence, the painters were from Venice, Raphael and Michelangelo and Fra Bartolomeo were from Florence, but Michelangelo spent an awful lot of time in Rome between 1508, 1512, and then again from 1534. He stays in Rome from 1534 up until his death. And so this isn't, the 1534 departure for Rome isn't necessarily relevant for this particular painting, but 1508 to 12, Michelangelo's in Rome. So you've got these Florentine artists and Giovanni Bellini, a Venetian artist, been commissioned to paint works for a castle, for a camera in a camera within a castle in Ferrara. And so that's why it's painted on canvas, so that it could be transported. Obviously with panel, you can't roll it up and put it on put it in a carriage to be installed elsewhere, but a canvas can be rolled up and transported, which is why it's on canvas. Later on, Venetian painters would continue painting on canvas because panels don't really live very long in Venice because of the humidity. It buckles the wood, so canvas is far more suited to Venice. We can talk about that a bit later on. Next week, we're going to be doing Giorgione, and then the series after that, we'll be doing Titian. So we'll talk a lot about canvas painting in Venice. All right, so so Duke Alfonso d'Este wanted these artists to paint the paintings for his camera. And what I'm going to do now is just move forward so that you can just see the figures. Okay, so Bellini delivered on this painting, okay, in 1514. He delivered on this painting. He wanted Michelangelo to do a mythological scene for the camera as well, but Michelangelo didn't really fulfill that. Michelangelo, it would be very hard to get him to do anything. You would really have to be a pope, and even if you were a pope, you'd be lucky if Michelangelo were to actually fulfill a commission. The funerary chapel for Julius II never got finished. In fact, it did get finished, but not by Michelangelo. So that's a real, he finishes the Capella Sistina ceiling and the final judgment, the last judgment. But there are two beautiful panel paintings in the National Gallery which are unfinished. Lots of unfinished sculptures. Michelangelo really doesn't fulfill. Michelangelo is notorious for not fulfilling commissions and for turning lots of people down. Lots of people want his drawings, but he virtually always denies them his drawings. He's very private about his drawings and very, very much bound up in what a very small number of patrons want him to do, but mostly what he really sees him, wants. What he really prioritizes more above anything else, rather than fulfilling a commission from anyone. So Duke Alfonso d'Este also commissioned Raphael and Fra Bartolomeo. He commissioned Fra Bartolomeo, but Fra Bartolomeo died in 1517. Fra Bartolomeo was a contemporary of Michelangelo, a slightly older contemporary of Michelangelo, who was also trained in the Ghirlandaio workshop. So a really, really big Florentine heavyweight. Not as famous as Michelangelo in his day, but really in the top rank of his day. Been, largely forgotten now, actually, Fra Bartolomeo. Amazing drawings, incredible drawings, and great paintings as well, and really did actually respond to a Venetian approach. One of the first Florentine painters to really respond dynamically to Florentine use of color, Venetian use of color, actually. But Fra Bartolomeo died in 1517 and wasn't able to fulfill commission for the camera of Duke Alfonso d'Este. Raphael then died in 1520, and before was able to finish a painting. The commission for Bacchus and Ariadne went first to Fra Bartolomeo. Fra Bartolomeo died in 1517, then Raphael, and then it fell to Raphael, but Raphael died in 1520 before he was able to start work on it. And then in 1523, Titian completed it. And so it went from Fra Bartolomeo to Raphael to Titian, when Titian was really an up-and-coming artist and finding his own way and trying to become one of the leading painters of the age, which he most certainly did. And in 1516, he became painter of the Republic of Venice, becoming the successor of Giovanni Bellini, which he really did earn. So let's get back on track and talk about this painting then. So Duke Alfonso d'Este, he wanted the best painters, and we've named them and we've spoken about them, to paint mythological scenes for his Camera dell'Alabastro in his castle in Ferrara. And this was to be really a place of contemplation and enjoyment of the arts. And that is really, the fact that he got Bellini to do this is really remarkable. It would have been a highly prestigious commission and something really, really important for Bellini to do, because it would show his ability to compete with artists who were much younger than him. He's in his 80s at this point. He's born sometime around 1430. And so he's about, he's in his 80s at this point. It is absolutely remarkable. And again, loads of landscape, which was subsequently really, we can't really see it because Bellini's landscape, because Titian and Dosso Dossi then painted over it. But the figures in the foreground are painted by Bellini. Okay, they may have been retouched by Titian later on, but it's difficult to say the extent to which he did. All right, so Dosso Dossi altered the landscape on the upper left and added the bright foliage and pheasant on the upper right. And then Titian overpainted virtually all of Dossi's landscape, and he painted that mountain, which is behind all of those figures. So he created the mountainous landscape, but he did leave the pheasant painted by Dosso Dossi. So we've got an amazing narrative here from Roman mythology with these gods. We can see Apollo with his Caduceus staff there, and you can see that nymph having her skirt lifted up, and we can see this god there putting his hand in between the legs of that young nymph. So it really does show the gods behaving like debauched people in a party. It's almost like a bacchanal of all of, so these mythological scenes were becoming increasingly popular at this point, and Titian would really develop on this theme. His Bacchus and Ariadne, which would also be hung in the Camera dell'Alabastro, is one of the most amazing paintings, which is currently in the National Gallery. We're definitely going to look at that in the next series. There's also his Feast of Venus and the Bacchanal of the Andrians, which were hung in the Camera dell'Alabastro, which are now at the Prado, Madrid. And so that is just, to go into, there should be an exhibition. In fact, it would be a great thing to do if you could speak to your curator at your local gallery, especially if they already have one of these paintings. This is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And if you could, if you're there, or I'm in London, so I could ask the curator at the National Gallery to do an exhibition to bring those paintings back together. Could you imagine this painting coming to the National Gallery to be hung beside the paintings from the Prado and the paintings in the National Gallery? It'd be absolutely brilliant. Yeah, it'd be lovely to recreate that scene, that scene that Duke Alfonso d'Este would have had in his Camera dell'Alabastro. Fantastic. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the last painting. We're going to spend plenty of time on it. Okay, and this is the last painting we're going to look at in this series. And it is one of the latest Bellini paintings, if not the... There is another painting from this period, which is really unusual as well. But this painting is one of the most unique and peculiar works in Giovanni Bellini's career. He virtually, he painted predominantly religious paintings, religious scenes, Christian ones. Previous painting we've looked at is already strange because it's a pagan mythological scene from Roman mythology, from Roman literature, from Ovid. This is a painting which doesn't have a clear genre. Now, this is something that would have really, that's something that really did put painting on a new footing in the period. A painting that doesn't have a clear genre, a clear identity within the different genres of painting. It's not a religious painting. It isn't, landscape hadn't really been explored as an independent genre by this point. Is it a portrait? Not possible really to know. A woman wouldn't have been painted nude like this if she was a noblewoman. She's nude. Well, she's not entirely nude because she has her privates covered by her by that drapery, but we do have a breast exposed, a nipple exposed, which does place this within the category of a nude. Okay, and there's so many amazing things here. We've got an amazing interior. We've got that beautiful Veneto landscape in conjunction with some still life. And there's something that he borrows from antiquity in this painting, which is that little piece of paper painted trompe-l'oeil in the foreground on that amazingly complex carpet, which is, indicative of northern influence. And that the detailed interiors and carpets are very influenced by northern painting. But that paper is really influenced by classical antiquity. It was Pliny the Elder in his Natural History who spoke about Apelles doing that, making people think that there was paper in physically there for real, when it was just painted, that trompe-l'oeil effect. So there is another really, really fascinating thing about this painting, and that is the use of the mirror, or mirrors. There are two mirrors. Now, we saw a painting last week, and if you missed last week, you'll have to go onto YouTube. And luckily, I'm putting these on YouTube now, because it means that if you miss one, you can just catch up and just re-watch it. And so, the mirror, we saw a mirror painted last week, didn't we? And it was in this painting, the amazing Arnolfini wedding painted by Jan van Eyck in 1434. That's just totally mind-boggling. Now, the painted mirror reflecting back into the viewer's space, for an artist to do that in 1434 is really totally beyond me. There isn't really a precedent for that. It's unprecedented. But then you have the mirror in the Bellini painting giving you a view. It is reflecting back into our space, given the position of the mirror. Not that he depicts any of our space, but he gives you another view of her head. And so, that is so remarkable, because in one painting, you've got two perspectives of the same person's head. That is not what you associate with early modern painting. You associate that with modern painting. It's, in Renaissance painting, one of the primary values is linear perspective, which gives you a sense of perspective from one point of view, from one viewing point. Bellini's introduced a second viewing point. I know that's what Van Eyck has done in that Arnolfini wedding, but what Bellini has done is introduced not just another viewing point coming from the mirror, but he's giving you a second perspective of her head. And it's the back of her head, which is really confusing and doesn't have an obvious kind of purpose. And so that ambiguity is indicative of Bellini exploring painting and the capacity of painting to be painting itself, to not be distinctly narrative of any particular subject or any particular story, not to have any particular and definitive meaning, but rather to just reflect on reality in some way or reflect on fantasy in some way. Painting just being painting, in other words, without having a clear definition or a clear subject or a clear narrative. It's the power of painting to be beautiful, the power of painting to stimulate the senses and the imagination and to have no clear or definite meaning to it. That is, you know, that is Bellini being a part of this movement going in towards the high Renaissance, and one of the most sophisticated and remarkable aspects of the high Renaissance, which is this idea of painting being a form of silent poetry, which does go back to ancient times. We mentioned Plutarch already, but it also is what distinguishes the greatest Venetian paintings from virtually everywhere else in Italy. The idea of painting being poetically ambiguous and not having a definite meaning or a definable meaning. It's going to get rid of the Van Eyck for it there. Okay, so we've got this amazing, astonishing painting by Bellini, The Young Woman at Her Toilet from 1515. Oh, it should say 1515 there. All right, so it's the most unusual painting in the entire corpus, in the entire oeuvre of Giovanni Bellini, because it is a female nude with no meaning, no definite meaning. There are some symbols in there, but there's no distinctive narrative. It's not a religious painting, and it's a nude, so very unusual for Giovanni Bellini. There's a beautiful window opening up to a stunning Veneto landscape with a beautiful sky. And there is a, you know, not only a mirror on the wall, but there's also a mirror in her right hand, and she's looking at herself. This is a remarkable painting because it also is reflective of not selfishness, but one's intimacy with oneself. That intimacy with oneself, you know, that self-reflection, that self-reflectiveness, that's a very private and intimate moment of self-reflection and self-awareness and looking and analyzing oneself. Is it merely superficial? Is it just a vanity? The mirror is a symbol of vanity in art. We know that. But I think there may be more to it. There may be something more complex than that to it. There's something honest about it. It's not necessarily a decadent self-reflection. I've got to show you another painting which really has these elements of that moment of being by one's self. And it's also a female nude, and it was also painted 5 years earlier by a former pupil of Bellini, and that is this painting by Giorgione. I'm only going to have it up there for a moment. This is a painting painted by Giorgione in around 1510, completed in around 1510. Titian may have added a bit to it around 1510. It may have been started around 1508, 1509, certainly finished by 1510 by Giorgione. And this is one of the first, well, it's the first nude like that in the entire Renaissance. Just a female nude in a landscape, and there's a very intimate painting. She's fully nude, just like the Uffizi Venus, or just like the Capitolini Venus, these two great sculptures that would have been known to these artists. And what we can see in Bellini's painting is him being aware of what his own younger contemporaries are doing, his younger contemporaries who he influenced, his younger contemporaries who wouldn't even be painting in oils in the way that they were if it were not for him. And he is responding to what they are doing and reinventing himself in the last years of his life. It's why I think he's one of the most remarkable artists of the entire history of Western art. Okay, so there we are back with the original painting, so that you can continue drawing that. So I wanted to show you the Giorgione because it really shows you a slightly earlier point of reference for us to see the context within which Bellini is innovating this new type of painting, or being a part of the innovation of this new type of painting, which has this level of ambiguity, and it opens up infinite interpretations for the viewer. It lets the painting be something ambiguous and open to discussion and open to discourse with the viewer, which is a great departure from tradition, the tradition of the Middle Ages in art, and the tradition of Gothic painting, and the tradition of Renaissance painting, the tradition that Bellini had been a part of up until this point. This is painting for the sake of painting, and something that Giorgione would exemplify. No, Giorgione was actually no longer around by the time Bellini painted this. Giorgione died in 1510, which was a great tragedy, a tremendous loss. But you can see that Bellini is actually responding to what he was doing, to what Giorgione had done. Giorgione was actually considered to be one of the great painters in Italy by the early 1500s. He was considered to be one of the greatest painters in Italy. His reputation really did last well into Titian's life, and Titian would have always have been aware of that Giorgione was this great competitor of his who he couldn't really compete with anymore because he had died, but Giorgione had established a very, very, very high standard and was considered to be one of the most sophisticated artists of the entire world of Italian painting. And it was in the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, where he outlined that Giorgione was by far the greatest painter of Venice, and that was while Titian was dominating that milieu. Okay, so there is one other painting, this time by Titian, painted in the same year, painted in 1515, a woman with a mirror. Okay, so painted in the same year as the Bellini, and you can see how much more modern, really, Titian's painting looks next to the Bellini. You can see that Titian, I mean, we can't really tell which one was painted first, but we've got two mirrors here. That young man is holding up a mirror for her to look in with his right hand, and then with his left hand, he's holding up another mirror. And so it's really a commentary on vanity, which I think is very similar to the Bellini painting. And we don't know who got the idea from who here. Did the idea really ultimately come from Giorgione? Giorgione did that, did the Sleeping Venus, the nude Sleeping Venus, before these two paintings were made. These both were made in 1515. Giorgione's Sleeping Venus was made in 1510. But two mirrors in each painting. I mean, they're very, very similar. I mean, with one hand, she's clasping her hair. There's also a little perfume bottle in each painting. It is just uncanny. The connection between these two paintings is quite remarkable. We can see the back of her head in that mirror. This is a real discourse between these two painters. I mean, that is undeniable. Titian's painting looks as though it came from a much later era, though. But that's because Titian is much younger, and he is really, at 1515, he's up and coming, and he's probably trying to displace his master. And he does. Well, he does. He is his successor. 1516, it's Titian who becomes painter of the Republic and becomes the greatest painter in northern Italy. And but there is a discourse between these two paintings, one the old master and one the young master. But the Titian is far more obvious. I think it's far more obviously about sensuality. It's more obviously about sex. It's far obviously about vanity. The way that she's clasping her hair is more indicative of one, concern with one's appearance. The way that her sort of shirt and her the string around her shoulder is coming off, revealing a shoulder like that is very sensuous. There's a blushing male there, very intimately close up to her, holding the mirror for her. Is he a servant or is he a lover? It's very sexy, the Titian painting, whereas the Bellini is far more mysterious, ambiguous, and less obvious. A bit more interesting, really, a bit more poetic, a bit more Giorgione-esque, perhaps. Okay, so we've got our Bellini again. Maybe I'll just show you one more painting. Another Titian painted much, much later. Another Titian painted in 1555. Okay, Titian wasn't anywhere near dead by that point. Titian died even later than that. Titian died in 1474. So he had an amazingly long career. But here we've got Venus. So this is where we have this kind of painting, this kind of scene, a nude and a mirror, having a mirror held for her there, but it's a mythological painting. So while the painting on the left by Bellini isn't a genre painting, well, it is kind of a genre painting, but it's also a nude and there's a landscape, and we're not sure if it's a portrait or not. It's not a Venus, it's just a young woman. But there on the right, we have a Titian painted in 1555, which is an actual Venus painting with cupids. So it's a mythological painting. Yeah, okay, so that's really, really fascinating. And then later on in the early 17th century, between 1613 and 1614, some young Flemish painter called, you may have heard of him, Rubens. So Peter Paul Rubens paints that. He's definitely inspired by Titian. Yeah, unquestionably inspired by Titian to paint that Venus. And she's got a mirror being held for her. And what's amazing about this painting is that we get a very, very, very clear view of Venus's face looking straight out at us. While we see the back of her head, we also see the front of her face looking straight into our eyes because of that mirror. And that is a really virtuoso painting, isn't it? I mean, Rubens did an amazing work on that one. Totally incredible. And it is all connected. It's all connected with this great tradition of Bellini and Giorgione and Titian. It really is Giorgione that started this development. It really is Giorgione that started this development, but he did it using what Bellini gave him. You know, Bellini was a great and most influential artist in Venice of his time when Giorgione was growing up. And Giorgione was profoundly impacted by Bellini, may not have been directly taught by Bellini, but was certainly impacted by his work. And we've seen that ambiguity in Bellini's work. We've seen that sense of, you know, if you go back to week 2, cast your mind back to week 2 and think of some of those paintings, the sophisticated poetic nature of Bellini's works from 1500 and before. So before Giorgione came of age, you can see that that is really what fed Giorgione's artistic self. And Giorgione really ran with all of that, which Bellini introduced. And that is what set this trajectory in momentum, which ends up arriving at Rubens doing this. You know, the history of art is all connected, and you don't really understand what painters are doing unless you know about the past, the history of painting. So you can actually speak on what this painting by Rubens on the right actually is and what it actually means now, because you can actually compare it to what came before it and say that the reason he's doing it in this way is because of what came before with Titian, with Giorgione, with Giovanni Bellini, and with Jan van Eyck in the 1430s, who Bellini was very, very aware of. He may never have seen the Arnolfini wedding, but he would have seen prints of it, most probably. And he would have been aware of, Jan van Eyck because of the massive influence that Jan van Eyck had on Antonello de Messina, and because there were Jan van Eyck paintings and Roger van der Weyden paintings in Italy at the time in Naples, and so they were known south of the Alps. And Petrus Christus, a great pupil of Jan van Eyck, had spent time in Italy, and so this great, development in painting goes all the way back to Jan van Eyck. And you know what? There is even another one. It's the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez. And that is probably one of the greatest paintings of all time. That's not just one of the best paintings in the National Gallery. That's not just one of the best paintings of the 17th century. That is one of the most remarkable paintings in the entire history of human creativity. That's not just one of the best paintings, that's one of the best artworks, or the most marvelous and miraculous expressions of human creativity in the history of life, in the history of this world. And it was unlocked, it was enabled, it was made possible because of this history that went all the way back to Jan van Eyck and before, and morphed in the hands of Giorgione and morphed in the hands of Giovanni Bellini, and came to Diego Velázquez via Titian and Sir Peter Paul Rubens. In the 1620s, Sir Peter Paul Rubens spent time in Madrid and got to know Velázquez in person, spent 9 months sharing a studio with Velázquez in the Alcázar in Madrid when Rubens was on a diplomatic mission to negotiate for peace with England, which is interesting because he was Flemish and he was a Catholic, an ally of Spain, whereas England was Protestant by that point under Charles I. And in the 1620s. But yeah, so that this great development of painting, it starts to make a bit more sense, and we start to actually experience it more with more depth, and to experience the actual reality of what's really there. You can't understand what the Rokeby Venus actually is, and what it actually means, and what its historical value and what its cultural significance is, without situating it in context with the development of the paintings that came before it, which actually shaped what it is. It's not only Velázquez's hands putting the paint on the Rokeby Venus, because if it hadn't been for Giorgione, if it hadn't been for Giovanni Bellini, if it hadn't been for Jan van Eyck and Titian and Rubens, you wouldn't have the Rokeby Venus. So utterly unbelievable and amazing. So last few words before we finish. I'd just like to talk about this painting a little bit more, the Giovanni Bellini. There's a great sense of solitude to it. She is alone in her space. It is very uncommon in Western painting for an individual to be occupying a space which is so remote from our view. She's not aware of us. It's this incredibly private painting. It's so unusual for Bellini to paint something like this. Very bold of him. How would he have even known where to start? He was so inexperienced at doing this type of painting. And so very bold, true artist, a truly great artist who's reinventing himself even in his last years, in his 80s, a very, very elderly man at this point. And, there's a sense of her in self-reflection, looking at herself. There's also an interior and a landscape, and no separation between our world and her world, in terms of a parapet distinguishing our space from hers. We just see the bottom, we just see her thighs there, and then the painting cuts off. And I mean, there's so many dimensions to the painting because of these elements, and the mirror reflecting back out to our space. it gives you a sense of the physical presence of her, the fact that we're not cut off from her space with a parapet or a border or anything like that. She's really up against the surface of the painting. And there's a beautiful sense of a particular moment in time, which I think really is remarkable in this painting. It's that very personal, intimate moment of self being aware of self within a very small, intimate space, which I think is so distinct from all of Bellini's other paintings, and really do situate it within an entirely new approach to making art, which is more commonly associated with a later period, a period of the High Renaissance. So he's an artist that is born in around 1430, okay? He dies in 1516. And we've seen a great deal of work from him, and it's been absolutely incredible. So everybody, thank you. I'm not going to say any more about Bellini. Next week, we're going to be doing Giorgione, which is going to be amazing. We're going to do a series on Giorgione, and then we're going to do a series on Titian. And yeah, I really hope you all really enjoyed today, that you had a fantastic session, and that you've enjoyed looking at Bellini over the last few weeks. Okay, thank you very much indeed.